Here's our dilemma. We have about 15 minutes remaining with Dr. Wallen, at which point he's going to need to leave in order to catch his plane back to California. What we'll do is we'll take 15 more minutes after that until 3:45 with Dr. Brickman and with Daniel Shaw to continue the discussion, maybe have some questions from the audience. Then at 3:45, Dr. Merle Jordan will close the conference with a few remarks. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our moderator for this final segment of the conference. Christopher O'Rourke is a licensed clinical social worker who is on the senior clinical staff of the Danielsen Institute. He is the director of social work training and continuing education and one of the members of the conference committee. So he has many hats and deserves a great welcome.
As my name suggests, I am not Jewish, and many have said. It is an honor, though, to hear, as a Roman Catholic, the three of you speak about the ways in which you have been formed and informed both by your Jewish heritage and your experience with the East and the traditions there. And so as we begin, I wonder, and perhaps we could start with you, David, what, as you listened to each other, what struck you? What surprised you, both about yourself and about the words that you heard nuancing your own work from each other?
Well, you know, among the most startling revelations, if you will. You know, when you talked about your experience, I found myself thinking about a patient of mine who I'm pretty sure was in the same ashram and has not left. I mean, he's moved from the upstate New York location, and he's no longer, in any case, I found myself thinking about, you know, the dark side, as you're putting it, of the, you know, the allure of the transcendent. And, you know, I'm also aware that I guess I found myself thinking about, in a sense, the kind of a both and rather than an either or when it comes to, you know, what I'm talking about is, you know, transcendent, if you will, and what you're talking about is immanent. Or another way to say it is that it seems to me that there's a very much of a reality both to the awareness of awareness, the no self that maybe we can discover at the center of what feels like the self, that there's a reality to that on the one hand, but that there's also a very, very important reality to, you know, what Owen Rennick calls, you know, a well-known analyst calls our irreducible subjectivity. I mean, it's a funny paradox to me that on the one hand, I can sit in meditation and feel that I have contacted a kind of impersonal awareness. And yet, the paradox, there's so much of the time when I seem, I mean, I'm the same me, right? But I can feel so far away from anything remotely like an impersonal awareness. You know, I feel instead just gripped by my own, you know, anger or tears or self-interest or, you know, and in moments like that, it's like I might reach for a sort of larger, more spacious kind of awareness of awareness. And sometimes I can actually find it, and it is affect regulating, but I guess I'm always aware of, as I say, kind of the both and rather than the either or. And I also couldn't help thinking of, when I was at High Holidays, or I guess Yom Kippur or whatever, the services this year, I heard probably for the, the third or fourth time, kind of the same story that those of us who are Jewish have probably heard many a time at many a service. And the story essentially is about, I'm sure I'm not going to get it right, but it's kind of like, somebody's on the way to shul or whatever and runs into this rabbi, Rabbi Shmuel or whatever, and how are you doing on this day, Rabbi? And I'm not doing so well, but why? I mean, you seem to be, so spiritually at home and so enlightened, and when it's over and you stand at the before God knows whom, God or whatever, how could you possibly have anything to complain about? You just seem, you followed God's precepts to a T every day or something like that, but. And the rabbi says, Rabbi Shmuel says, yes, but I may have followed God's precepts, but have I followed Rabbi Shmuel's precepts? Mm-hmm. It's that, and that whole notion of like the life well lived as a life where we really in some way manifest who we are. At our heart, at our best, did we live the life that we were meant to live, that we wanted to live, that expressed our deepest aspirations for ourselves? Like there's that, alongside of the transcendence, which is a sort of no self, no self, and it's both seem vitally important to the experience of being human. So that's I could go on, but
could I slip something in here that is actually part of the rabbinic mystical tradition is to talk about you called it a dialectic, they call it the paradox of the ought and the not, that the head, at the heart of the mystical experience is both the nothing and the everything. Mm. And so maybe this is not a contradiction that has to be resolved, but is really a paradox that we're always living in the midst of.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just tell them one thing that's
Please.
Just pretty hilarious. When I first wrote Dan and found out how similar our backgrounds were, he wrote back and said, the ashram I lived at for all these years was on Brickman Road, he said.
Brickman Road.
Brickman Road.
Perfect.
No relation, but it was pretty funny.
Well, I do agree with you that is a profound paradox, and by breaking it up into immanence, transcendent, I knew that I was, creating a false dichotomy. But in my case, I wanted to use that as a way of talking about the perils of pursuing a transcendence at the expense of having a self. Mm. And there's the opposite, having a self without having anything beyond just self.
Yes, yeah. I was thinking that there was a kind of case vignette that I was going to make use of that actually involved this patient who I think may have been involved with the same ashram. And essentially, the vignette was meant to communicate, the sort of the clinical downside of my, in a certain sense, being on the same spiritual path as this patient. In other words, he makes a priority of a certain kind of transcendence of the self. He makes I don't know if he uses the same language, but he makes a priority of identifying with a larger self, the universal self that is no self, and all of that. And I can find, it was in the first session, it was so transparently obvious to me that in the course of our therapy, his preference for transcendence was going to function almost like, what Winnicott calls a false self. And yet, as the therapy has gone on, I'm really aware of a kind of doubleness. That on the one hand, his spirituality may represent a kind of refuge from the complexities of his experience of his more authentic self. It may represent a refuge, and yet it's also a resource. It's clearly also a resource. But the trick for me as his therapist is not to fall into the kind of the mutual admiration society in a sense. Well, we both know what's kind of bigger and better. It is that identification with transcend, and so I've gradually sort of gotten on top of some of these enactments, if you will, in which he kind of goes down the transcendent path, and I'm sort of with him, and then suddenly I realize, wait a sec, we're getting away from something that is much more emotionally grounded, and we're, in a sense, colluding to stay away from what's, maybe what's painful.
Mm-hmm. What's in the guts and the heart, as opposed to what's up above the sahasrara,
Yeah.
I had a Buddhist patient who also seemed to be using the idea of detachment as a way of avoiding every kind of emotional conflict and commitment or conviction. And we struggled together quite a bit with that. And we never finished, he finished before I wanted him to, so about 10 years later I got an email. Thank you for everything you said. Here's my wife, here's my baby.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, but that detachment had been his way of just slipping away from anything that was difficult, and he thought it was really like that was his way of being a Buddhist. So.
Well, I think you could look at the urge for transcendence as as a function of what you call an avoidant personality at its worst, and the function of somebody who has none of that and clings only to the everyday subjective as the function of what you call the preoccupied self. And so both of them have something to offer, and both of them can take you down weird roads that separate you from a full way of living.
There's what you're saying makes me think of a kind of an added complexity to all this, which is, and maybe you could speak to this in some way as an expert on cults. But the complexity is, when I work with a patient like the one I've just been talking about, and I would actually think of this guy, first of all, this preoccupied and dismissing, I think that's really, really useful for research purposes, but for clinical purposes, I think we're much more complicated than that. So for example, with this guy, I think of him in some ways as more preoccupied. I sometimes think security is, when we experience a secure state of mind, a relationship is a context in which there's room for two. In a dismissing state of mind, a preoccupied state of mind, there's room for one. In a dismissing state of mind, the one is the self. And in a preoccupied state of mind, the one is the other. So with this particular patient, there's a drift toward preoccupation in which the guru, the therapist, the father, you know, we take up most of the psychological space. But the complexity, I can talk to him about, you know, I take up a lot of space, your father takes up a lot of space, but it's very hard to say the guru takes up a lot of space. I just feel like I'm just stepping on his toes in some way that's very challenging. You know, it's like I can't say. I haven't really wanted to say, but I certainly couldn't say, you know, don't you see you're in a cult? You're giving yourself away to...
You know, there are so many kinds of Hindu traditions, so I don't want to speak as though I'm talking about all of it. But certainly in the tradition I was in, one of the most, well, what was considered the absolutely highest practice was to meditate on the guru and to install the guru into every single cell of your being as you meditated on the form of the guru. And that would be considered the perfect practice, the best of them all. So in a sense, you are truly being taught that, you know, any of what's just your everyday self, your subjectivity, that's really all just garbage. And it should just be evacuated. You should empty the whole thing out and just stick the guru in there. And this is really what's preached. And this is, I'm sure it's not just in the group I was in.
Yeah.
So you know, to speak to your patient about the guru taking up space, well, duh, that's what he wants. That's what he's sought. Yeah. You know, he would probably give you an argument about that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he has come to you, which indicates that his experience is something. He has a sense that something isn't quite right, and I would suggest that it's really quite a developmental process. Because yes, if you were to say that right now, you would destroy him. But that hopefully would be something that eventually you would begin to say as he started to strengthen other parts of himself.
That's a nice point.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And we need to pause here because it is time for you to leave
Parting
us.
is such sweet sorrow.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Must we part?
It's too bad.
It's only an airplane. Maybe they'll hold it for me.
At a later flight.
Or is that grandiose?
So great to have you.
As a wise man once said, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end.
Hey.
There we go.
I'll have to use that line. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, thank you.
What a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, I wish we had more time to talk.
Likewise.
Okay.
So perhaps at this point we might take some questions for our last 15 minutes from people in the audience. Thoughts, questions, impressions. Somebody has the microphone? Yes, thank you, Miriam.
Hello. Yes, I have a question for you. I'll posit it just very precisely. In response to the paradox that David Wallen addressed directly, self, transcendent self, authentic, no self. So the question is this: what would happen if one substituted the concept and notion of intersubjectivity as, in a way, the actual way it is, as a substitute for subjectivity? That's the best, shortest way I can ask the question, just by way of saying, it seems to me that subjectivity is taken as the basis for comparing and contrasting this paradox. So my mind goes, well, what would happen if we simply switched that? And that intersubjectivity were actually the case, which resolves a lot of the issues in a way. So I'm positing that as a question to our panel.
Well, my answer will be subjective. Sorry. But I, in my, at this point where I'm at with all of this is that, the experience of being a subject has taken on a tremendous amount of meaning for me, because I recognize the extent to which I was self-objectifying. And it's having my sense of myself as a subject that opens the door for me to intersubjectivity, because otherwise I have to be an object. If I don't have my subjectivity, I need to figure out what you want of me and give it to you. I need to figure out how you think about me and feel about me and adjust myself according to what will satisfy your needs. With my subjectivity, then we can have an intersubjectivity. That's the best way I can put it.
I think if we go back to Jessica Benjamin's work, I think her main point, in a sense, was that it takes two subjects to have a relationship. So you only have a real intersubjectivity if you have two subjects. And when there's a failure one way or another, then you have the domination and subjugation. And so that's one way of addressing what you're saying. Another way I heard it was perhaps, is the relationship with the transcendent an intersubjective relationship, which would be another way of thinking of that. And I'm sure there are theologians who are writing along those lines as we speak. Although not being a theologian myself, I couldn't tell you who they are. But once again, I think for a Western and non-mystic tradition, because you will find in Western mystical traditions a very similar abnegation of the self as the sine qua non of a mystical experience. You have only to read Thomas Merton to see that. But for what we're talking about, I think there is a sort of sense that it takes a whole person to have an intersubjective relationship with another whole person or with something greater than oneself.
So it seems to me that you've made very powerful stories and arguments for the idea that people need to hold this tension of subjectivity and transcendence, and maybe that people have to come to it in different ways or move in a different direction at different times, because that's the move towards wholeness for them, or that's the way they can take it up. Now, from a clinician's perspective, it makes sense to me in the room that you might have to sort of feel that out with the person in front of you and sort of know it through the interaction or with them. But how do you work with the reality that we're in process too, and that our knowing of where they are and the next movement that's useful for them is done while we're in our own process and our own knowing may be colored or limited? I just wondered if you could each speak a little bit about that. Having, in a sense, to work with in the dark, and yet be responsible for that, and yet be humble enough to know that our own impulse may be off in a given moment, and yet that simply turning away because there's some pushback might be a little too soft as well.
Well, I don't really think that you ever work with somebody towards transcendence or towards immanence, or I think that these are states that, two things. I think that in your own stance, as I'm sitting here talking to you, I can do my best to make myself available to as much as I can. And sometimes, if I'm really lucky, that the person I'm working with makes themselves available in such a way that that there is a kind of moment. But I really don't believe there's any such thing as making a transcendent moment happen or forcing it to happen or even trying to bring, somebody is where they are, and that's where we have to meet them. And so a lot of this, and David's, I think David Book says this in a number of places, a lot of this is really about the stance with which we sit in our chair and listen, rather than something that we do or say or try and make happen.
I think I may not understand the question fully, or I may have a different understanding. I think you were asking if, given that I might not be fully conscious of and somewhat dissociated, can I feel confident about how I am perceiving it and interacting with the person I'm working with? And it's just a given. I'm not fully conscious and I am somewhat dissociated. It's a given. It's not, I'm not ashamed. that is a place of, because I'm discovering myself through the patient, and the patient is discovering himself through me. This is an exchange going on. And at some point, and I forget somebody gave a good clinical example of this. I'm forgetting now, but you just get this chafing, as Donald Stern put it, about, gee, wait a minute, something's happening right now, and I'm not quite sure I'm on the right track, or am I not present right now? And David speaks to that, his use of mindfulness as a way of just checking in with himself. Let me pull back for a minute. I'm getting lost in what's happening here. And these moments to me are very important, and I don't try to avoid them. It's important not to fall into the trap of imagining that we're to be omnipotent and omniscient. That's exactly who I never want to be as a therapist. I had that guru.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Shara and Dr. Brickman. My name is Pauline Jeanette, and having traveled to India and interviewed dozens of students for academic purposes, I was interested in your reflections on the stark objectification of the India caste system, and does that lend itself to a guru that maybe transcends class in an Indian society, and how is that attractive to the Western society, and how you've experienced that in counseling and in your own individual experiences?
Did you see the caste system? Yeah, well, had I had another hour and a half, because a lot of being in India, everything that I talked about aside was an incredible experience about learning about another culture and its ins and outs. So there's a number of things to be said. First of all, the kinds of experiences that Daniel and I went through, I think are much more frequently experienced by Westerners than by Indians. Were you here when Dr. Akbar spoke the other day? He talked about how vision is important in India. And in India, for, let's say, the common everyday person in the street, well, I'll get to the caste system in a moment, but people believe in reincarnation, and they're not nearly as impatient as we are to get enlightened tomorrow. So they're not quite as, there are people who reject this life and become sadhus, or people who religious people who wander around and live on alms. But most people are content to have a guru who is somebody they visit once in a while and in whose presence they bask, and they feel that the presence or the vision of this person, the darshan, gives them a sense of holiness that carries them for the next week, the next whatever. I think something very particular happened when, in the 60s, when the first Westerners came to India, and then when these gurus started coming to the States. Westerners were and especially because Westerners came in the 60s. So this is a very different generation than, say, 50 years ago. The Westerners who came in the 60s, on the one hand, were extremely disrespectful of Indian culture, which was disliked by many people, but was also seen as Westerners are up for anything. And so the kinds of abusive relationships that we see, I don't know that you see. I mean, I can't. India is enormous. There's like hundreds of millions of people who live there. I cannot speak for all of them, but my impression is that the kinds of experiences we went through are somewhat more typical for Westerners. The caste system, in my opinion, is a blight in that country. That I say that because that was also Gandhi's opinion, so I'm not the only one who held that opinion. It's a very tricky situation, and it's much, much more complex than we tend to think of here, because while it's said in the Shastras that there are 4 castes, there actually are millions upon millions, and it is a way that people can, it's a kinship system. And it guides people as to who they may or may not marry, who they may or may not associate with, and so on and so forth. It also will guide people as to who their guru may be, and even in religious celebrations. For instance, there's a celebration just around now which celebrates part of the story of the Ramayana, which is the story of Rama who went down to fight the demon Ravana. And most caste systems do a sort of morality play in all across the country in all these little temples. The subcaste or outcast, or the people that Gandhi wanted to call the Harijans, or the children of God, they do their own play. They don't do it in a temple, they do it in the street, and it's a different part of the story, interestingly enough. It's a later chapter. It's a problem that the Indian government is trying to address. They have affirmative action for what they call scheduled castes, but I would still bet you that if you went and visited, let's say, this guru at her particular ashram in wherever in India, I would bet you that there would be no outcast people there. Those would be the people who would be cleaning the streets, cleaning everything. You know, in Hindi, as I'm sure in other Indian languages, there are 3 or 4 modes of address. There's a mode of respect, there's a mode of casualness, there's a mode that you use only for the outcast people. It's sort of a very derogatory mode. So even just in how you speak to somebody, people don't, the castes, the upper caste people mix, but the outcast people are really, at least when I was there, it was really looked down upon for them to mix at all.
It's hard to say how India has changed a great deal since I was there last, from what I understand. I don't disagree with anything you've said. The gurus who have attracted the Western following are not a good example of the society at large. Those gurus with the Western followings are conducting a particular kind of business, and their attitudes and how they present themselves, are probably not typical of somebody who's really just, staying in their own country. So
we are, alas, at time, and so our most sincere thanks to Daniel Shaw and Celia Brickman, and we will now turn the conference over to Merle Jordan.